بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق وخاتم لما سبق نصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره ومقداره العظيم. O Allah, we ask you to send your blessings upon our Master Muhammad, the opener of what was closed and the seal of what came before him, champion of the truth by the truth and guide to the straight path, and upon his family and companions as is befitting his noble rank. Ameen. Allahumma ya Kareem akramna bi nur al-fahm wa akhrajna min dhulumat al-wahm wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. O Allah, the noble, the generous, we ask you to ennoble us with the light of understanding and to remove us from the shadows of illusion. And there is no power nor might except through God. Ameen. Okay, so we are going to talk about food and drink and, how Muslims eat and drink and how we don't eat and drink, as the case may be. And I want you guys to think about what we're saying here tonight in light of what we said last week, right? We talked about the maqasid of the Sharia and like the things that the divine law tries to preserve. And we mentioned those things. They were in this order: religion, life, intellect, family, and wealth. And then some people say honor and adornment or beauty, although that's a weaker opinion. But the first five are pretty well agreed upon. And I think that this is a topic where you really get to see how that sort of plays out, because what we eat and what we drink, I think, as we will see, affects all five of those. So that was not just a theoretical, sort of cool thing to talk about. We're actually going to see how it works in our day-to-day life and the decisions that we make about what we put into our body. And when it comes to this topic of what Muslims do and do not put into their bodies, what's the two big ones that everyone knows about? What don't we consume as Muslim? Pork and alcohol. Yeah, exactly. That's what everyone sort of knows about us. Or as I like to say, no wine and no swine. We don't do those two. But it's actually a bit more subtle than that. And what I mean is that there's actually more to it. And this is something I really want to emphasize, because I was probably Muslim for 7, 8 years before I realized this. And part of the reason for that is the way that Muslims talk about this topic, I think, actually rests on a lot of false assumptions. And so I want to ask everyone to do something tonight, which is forget everything you think you know about eating and drinking and the prohibitions around that. Inshallah, I'm going to take you into a little more depth, a little more subtlety, and I think we'll come away with a more nuanced understanding of what God actually expects of us. And to begin this, I want to read you a verse from the Quran, which really kind of lays out how we're going to be talking about food and drink tonight. This comes in Surah Al-Baqarah, the second chapter of the Quran, the chapter of the cow. And Allah says, Ya ayyuhalladhina, or Ya ayyuhan nas, kulu mimma fil ardi halalan wa tayyiban, wa la tatabi'u khutuwat ash-shaytan, innahu lakum adu'un mubin. God says, "O humanity." And so God is talking to everyone here. This is God's advice, God's prescription, not just for the Muslims. God talks to different groups of people in the Quran. And it's always very important to pay attention to who exactly he's talking to. Here, he's talking to all of us because we all have bodies, right? And we all have the need to nourish ourselves So God's talking to all of humanity, right? Other places he says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu wa amilu salihat. Oh, you who believe and do good works, right? And he'll have more specific advice for that group of people. But everyone eats, everyone drinks. And so this is guidance for everyone. He says, eat from what is upon the earth that is halal, permissible, and tayyib, wholesome, like good for you, like nourishing. And do not follow in the footsteps of the shaitan, the devil. Indeed, he is a clear enemy for you. So this is sort of interesting, like right off the bat. There's a connection that God is making between what we eat and what we drink and Satan's attempt to sort of misguide us. We're going to talk about what that connection is. But this verse really frames for us how we eat and how we drink. And it gives us the terminology that we really need to do that correctly. Now, what word did you not hear that you have probably heard in connection to food, and specifically meat, eating meat? We have halal and tayyib. What word did you not hear? Haram, yeah. Yeah. Haram would be anything that falls outside of what is halal. Yeah. But zabiha, yes. God didn't say anything about zabiha. We're going to come back to that. Because when you hear Muslims talk about food, especially American Muslims, you hear this word a lot, zabiha. And this is not a word that actually comes from our Sharia. It's not a word that comes from our divine law. Interesting, right? I think that comes as a surprise to a lot of people. We'll come to that. But God does say the word halal. So let's talk about that. We need to understand what is halal. Halal means permissible. And God is very clear in the Quran. He tells us that in no case, never, absolutely ever, will pork be halal. So just give up on pork. Just forget about it. Even if you grew up with pork chops, I grew up with pork chops. You know, give up the pork chops, give up the bacon. There's beef bacon anyway, by the way, guys, and it's really good. It's really good. Get you some beef bacon. But that's one that is just never permissible. What else is never permissible? According to the Quran, blood. That's right. We don't eat blood. We don't eat blood. What else? Yes. Although there are exceptions to this, but predators. Predators. And really, for many of the same reasons, like if you get into like the commentary on this, predators are forbidden for the same reason that pigs are forbidden, because they have spiritual qualities to them that we don't want to imbibe. This is not according to the Quran. This is not according to the Messenger of Allah, as far as I know. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is according to some of our spiritual teachers, but there's a similarity there between pigs and predators. Predators are aggressive, passionate creatures. Pigs are greedy, slothful creatures. These are character traits that we don't want for ourselves. We'll come back to that. And there's another one. Does anybody know the other one? Yes, something that was sacrificed to another deity. Yes, that is one. Actually, yeah, thank you. That wasn't the one I was thinking of, but that is one. And then carrion, something that has already died. This is like I'm from the South, so I'll stereotype my people. There's the stereotype of like, hillbillies or rednecks down south that if they see a dead deer on the side of the road, they will stop and pick it up and they will have that for dinner. It's called roadkill. And, some stereotypes have a basis in reality. I've never seen anyone serve roadkill, but I have heard tales that this is indeed something that some Southerners do. So, if these Southerners were to embrace Islam, this would be off the menu. Roadkill. You'd have to give it up. You'd have to shoot that deer yourself and say Bismillah before you pull the trigger. So, yeah, what is halal? These are the things that are never permissible for us to eat under any circumstances. And then there are animals that we can eat, but that are haram, that are forbidden until they are slaughtered properly, right? And when an animal is slaughtered properly, according to our understanding, what that means is that the neck is cut. And as the neck is being cut, or if you're hunting, as the arrow is being fired or the bullet is being shot, you say Bismillah, Allahu Akbar. And this is something that not just Muslims can do, but that Christians and Jews may do as well. And we will consider that to be halal, permissible. I shop at an Amish grocery store and I buy meat there sometimes because the Amish actually say prayers as they slaughter their animals. And so, as far as I'm concerned, that is halal. If you want to go and buy kosher food, that is halal, right? So halal is actually a category that encompasses food that is slaughtered by a larger group of people than just Muslims. Any people who believe in the oneness of God, who invoke God's name as they are slaughtering the animal, that food is halal for us to eat. It's permissible. Okay, so God says, eat from what is permissible and what is tayyib, or wholesome. And here we get into, food that will actually nourish you. And I think even more difficult than finding halal meat in America, not because it's hard to come by, but because we don't have the habit of eating in a healthy way. So it's more difficult to prescribe people to eat tayyib than it is to eat halal. Because the majority of what you can buy in a grocery store is just really bad for you. This comes as a surprise to some people. Have you ever heard that you ought to stay on the perimeter of the grocery store? Well, it's good advice. Even like for us, like spiritually as Muslims, this is good advice because that is where most of the tayyib food is. That's where the fruits and vegetables are. That's where the plain old dairy and meat and things that have not really been processed that much. You start getting into the center aisles and you get the highly processed stuff. The stuff that frankly you probably wouldn't want to eat if you knew what was in it. So this is tayyib. And God is telling us your food should be both permissible and wholesome. And this is actually difficult to find. We'll talk about this. We're going to get into like some practical stuff. Right now, we're just going over the categories. When we get into the practical stuff, we'll talk about like how do you actually go about finding this type of food. So halal and tayyib. And then God says, and do not follow in the footsteps of the shaitan, for indeed he is a clear enemy for you. So what's going on here? What is the connection between what we eat and what we drink and the devil? And, oh no, maybe Adam needs to eat. By the way, we have cake. Now here I am. I just told you to eat what's tayyib. But we have a whole cake. It was from Amir's going away party last night. So if you want to disregard my advice, there's plates, there's forks, and there's cake up there. Feel free. You can't always be both halal and tayyib. Sometimes you gotta get a little wild. Okay, what's the connection between food and our spiritual state? Because really this is what is being invoked here. God is saying that Satan actually is calling us away from something with the enticement to eat things that are neither permissible nor good for you. And really, this gets back to a big spiritual practice of ours, which is fasting. Like in the month of Ramadan, we are doing something with our stomachs, right? We are depriving our stomachs. We're saying, you're not going to have anything that makes you happy from sunup to sundown. One of the effects of fasting, God says of the month of Ramadan in the Quran, that the purpose of it, he says, fasting has been prescribed for you as it was prescribed for those who came before you, that perhaps you might attain taqwa, God consciousness. That our consciousness of God, our spiritual state, our connection to our Creator and our Lord actually has something to do with our stomachs. And this is not an obvious connection for many people the first time that they hear it. But the more that you practice it, I think the more sort of intuitive this becomes. When you deprive your stomach, you are depriving that main thing that feeds your nafs, which is your lower self, your animalistic self, that part of you that you actually have in common with animals. Animals have a nafs. And the nafs has two main drives to it: appetite and passion. And if you can control your appetite, you can control everything about your nafs. You can tame it. And in fact, we see, like, for people who actually tame animals for a living, one of the ways that they will do this is through the deprivation of food. They will deprive an animal of food to bring it into a, you might say spiritually, but like in terms of its life energy, it becomes more obedient. It becomes more susceptible to influence. And so too do we when we deprive ourselves, or when we simply nourish ourselves with food that is good and wholesome and permissible rather than junk. We have this saying in America, you've all heard it: you are what you eat, right? Same thing. This is the same thing God is saying here. You are what you eat. You eat bad food, you eat food that corrupts your body, your spirit will become corrupted. You will become more susceptible, just as your body will become susceptible to disease. Your heart will become susceptible to disease. Your heart will become susceptible to the influence of the shaitan. This is what God is saying here. So it's very important what we put into our bodies. And we can kind of see this logic when we look at the things that God has forbidden us. So let's go into that just a little bit, and then we'll get practical and talk about, like, how do we actually go about eating food that is both permissible and wholesome for us. So let's talk about pork. I think, people often want to know when they're learning about this religion for the first time, like, why don't Muslims eat pork? And a lot of people really like pork. There's like a lot of food that comes from pigs that a lot of people in this world really like. And so it's a real question for some people, like, why wouldn't you eat this? There's like, in China, like, pork is a big, big food, a big, big food. And in Europe, pork is a big, big food. You guys heard this saying, like, you're living high on the hog? No one's ever heard this? I heard it growing up. Maybe it's more of a Southern thing. I'm not sure. But it actually refers to, like, the cuts of pork that come from higher up on a pig. These were considered to be nicer cuts. And so if you could eat from high on the hog, you were eating very well. And like the Italians, they do so much with pork, right? So why don't we eat it? What's wrong with it? The interesting thing is God actually doesn't say why. He just says don't do it. And so there's some mystique around this prohibition. you don't get the full reasoning for why it has been forbidden to you. But as I mentioned, uh, scholars have commented on this. And what many scholars say is that the spiritual quality of a pig is greed and extravagance. And I think, look, a lot of us are urbanites here. Even though I grew up in the South, I'm an urbanite. Like I've been living in cities for probably more than half of my life now. And so maybe you're thinking, like, what are you talking about? The spiritual quality of a pig. But spend time around animals and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Animals have different natures, they have different types of temperaments. A pig behaves very differently from a cow. Cows are like really, really freaking chill. You could, like, if you just wanted to go have a nice, relaxing day, you could go spend it with a cow and it would probably be very nice. A female cow. Bulls obviously have a different reputation. A pig, on the other hand, pigs actually have a greedy quality to them. Watch them eat. Now, you put cows to a trough and they will sort of wander over very slowly. They will eat from that trough. There's not going to be any like fighting, generally speaking, between the cows. You put pigs at a trough and it's mayhem. It can be mayhem because they'll be like jumping over each other, greedily trying to get the food and have as much of it for themselves as they possibly can get. So this is indeed a quality of this animal. And extravagance. Now, not like, shopping at Saks Fifth Avenue extravagance, but like, they roll in mud. They sort of, I want to say, like, let it all hang out. Like they don't really have a whole lot of shame as animals. Um, these are qualities of a pig. And there is an assumption, for the same reason that there is an assumption about predators, that when you consume an animal that has a quality like this, you are, in a sense, taking on this quality. And you are taking on qualities that feed your appetite or feed your passions. And these are the two parts of our nafs that, in fact, we are trying to tame. So while we aren't given explicit reasons for why pigs are forbidden for us to eat, this is something that, a lot of like our scholars have intuited about the reason why possibly they could have been forbidden to eat. Now, I have a friend who works on a ranch, and she told me this story about pigs. This is a ranch where they have like cows, goats, and sheep because they're Muslims. There are no pigs on their ranch, but they know other ranchers in their area. And she said that her father was talking to another one of these ranchers one day, and this guy was like, "You guys are Muslim, right?" And her father said, "Yeah, we are." And he said, "So you don't eat pigs, is that correct?" And he said, "Yeah, we don't eat pigs at all. On our ranch, we have cows, goats, and sheep, and that's it." And he said, "I think I get it, like why you guys don't eat pigs. I understand it. Whenever we slaughter a pig, or let me back up. He said, whenever we slaughter a cow, we have to be very quick in butchering that animal because the flies will swarm it very, very quickly. And you can't have that because they lay eggs and then you get maggots in the meat. And it's really, really unsanitary and gross." He said, when we slaughter a pig, the flies don't touch it. And he's like, I'm just sitting here wondering, like, what do the flies know that I don't know? And that story always stuck with me. There is something about a pig, and like, we don't know what it is from Revelation, but there is something about a pig that God is telling us, I'm not going to make it permissible for you. And based on this verse, we can probably assume that there is something that is not wholesome about it, even if we don't know exactly what that is. Um, Now, people sometimes have questions about, okay, like what about leather? Because a lot of leather comes from pigs. Can I wear that? Is that an okay thing to do? And the answer is yes. You can, like, if your watch strap is leather or your belt is leather, whatever, that's actually fine to wear, but not to pray in. So, just like take your watch off, unless you know that it's cowhide, right? Then you can keep it on. But try not to pray in these things. It's not something you want on your body as you're engaged in prayer. Um, but let me also remind you that pigs, we're talking about pork, pigs are fine. Pigs are one of God's creations. And as one of God's creations, or like we understand to be enveloped in the same mercy that you and I are. Like if pigs were haram, they would not exist because that would mean that God forbade their existence. He's just saying, don't eat them, right? So, if you're ever at a petting zoo and a pig wants a pet from you, you know, it's okay. Go for it. You can pet it. It'll be fine. And I mentioned this is for the Maliki school. In the Maliki school, which is my school, and it's also the school that the book, Being Muslim, is written from, uh, any living creature is pure. There's nothing dirty about it. So even if the pig licks you, that's okay for Malikis. Um, so be aware, like we're talking about consuming these things. The things that the Sharia judges is our actions as human beings, right? So our consumption of pork, our consumption of alcohol, or our consumption of a steak that was not slaughtered correctly. Okay, now let's go on to intoxicants. We'll do swine and wine because that's what everyone wants to know about. And then we'll talk about the other stuff. So it's actually more than wine. Um, this is any intoxicant. We don't indulge. We don't indulge. Um, Somewhat funny that I guess I need to say this. This includes weed. Don't smoke weed. A lot of Muslims these days are smoking weed. I hear about it all the time. And oftentimes you'll talk to them and they'll say, it's not alcohol. And it's like, well, I'm afraid you've misunderstood what what our religion says about this. So the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, there's this word in Arabic, khamr, khamr, and this word originally was used to refer to wine, right? Um, he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, every intoxicant is khamr, and every khamr is forbidden. So anything that alters your state of consciousness to a state where you are not in your fully awake conscious state of mind, that is an intoxicant, and that is something that ought to be avoided. I'm adding some detail and some specificity here because actually at one point for many Muslims there was a question around caffeine. Some people said, like when coffee was first discovered, by the way, it was discovered by Muslims. Did you guys know this? Muslims discovered coffee. Yeah. And for many, many centuries, it was actually considered to be a Muslim drink. And it was forbidden in Europe, in European Christendom. Because they said that's, what did they call it? They called it the Mohammedan berry, is what they called coffee. Until I forget which pope it was. It was a pope who basically issued a decree legalizing coffee for Christians because he said this is so delicious that the Muslims shouldn't be the only ones to have it. But even for Muslims, there was some question about its permissibility because it does affect your state of consciousness to some degree. It raises it in a sense. It makes you more aware. It's a stimulant. But the consensus that was reached over the years, over the centuries, is that this does not alter your consciousness in a way that is impermissible because it doesn't lead you to do anything that you wouldn't otherwise do, right? Your decision-making process is not impaired. Your motor skills are not impaired, right? And probably a number of other reasons. So that's why I'm getting into some subtlety there. Now, this needs to be understood about intoxicants because it is of a different quality than pork. And I'll put it to you like this. God actually describes rivers of wine that flow in paradise. Isn't that interesting? So, and wine is something that God says you will indulge in paradise. There are no rivers of pork chops in paradise. I'm sorry for anyone who really likes pork chops, but there are rivers of wine. And where God just forbade the consumption of pork, alcohol was actually forbidden over a period of time. And there were verses revealed about alcohol that did not immediately forbid its consumption. So let's go through that because this is actually important for us to understand that, what God is doing with these prohibitions is he's not trying to make your life dull and boring. For every prohibition, you ought to understand that there is something that is being harmed, whether it's religion, life, intellect, family, wealth, honor, or beauty. Like one of these things is being harmed. And so God is actually trying to make our lives better by forbidding these things. Okay, so let's read the first verse that was revealed about wine. So this is God talking to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he says, "They ask you about wine, khamr, and gambling." Interesting that these two things are paired together. Say, in them is great sin, yet some benefit for people, but their sin is greater than their benefit. So you actually see that people were coming to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and asking him, what is the status of this thing? We want to know. Should we be drinking wine? Is it okay? Now, this is interesting. This is really interesting. We gloss over this a lot, but this verse was revealed in Medina, which, if you remember from the portion of the class on the biography of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Muslims did not go to Medina until 13 years after the initial revelation. So this tells you right off the bat that God didn't say to the Prophet, that first revelation, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, stop drinking wine. It wasn't like that. No, like at least 13 years passed, over a decade passed, before God started issuing prohibitions like this. Why? Because what God wanted for the people was for their hearts to be attached to him. And that happened. That happened to the point where people actually wanted to know, what is God's will for me when it comes to things like drinking wine? We want to know. We're asking for an answer here, right? They come to you asking about wine. This is what the verse says. So God's not trying to be like a party pooper here. He's not trying to ruin your life and like suck all the fun out of it. That's not what this is about. And God, even in this lead up to the prohibition on wine, what he's saying is there's some good in it. There's some good in it. But there's also evil, and the evil's greater. So I'm not going to prohibit you from drinking it right now. It's almost like, look, people come to me sometimes for advice. They're like, what should I do? And, frankly, like I'm not the type to really like tell people what to do with their lives. And so oftentimes I'll say, well, here's what I do. And I'll make no suggestion about what they should do. Here's my experience with this thing, right? What I have found is that the harm outweighs the good. That's what God's doing here. He's like, I'm trying to leave a window open for you in case, you just really like to get down at these parties, which they did, by the way. At Juma a few weeks back, I narrated this hadith about Hamza, radiallahu anhu. You guys know Hamza, the lion of Allah, the uncle of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam? He got drunk. And he did, some crazy stuff that offended the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He did some crazy stuff. We think about the companions and we tend to think about these highly moral, almost angelic creatures. No, they were human beings. They got up to some dirt sometimes. They had passions and they had appetites just like anyone else. And God's habit with them was not to come down on them harshly. Just look, if you really want to know, it's more bad for you than it is good. Let's leave it at that. But they continue asking. So another verse comes down. O you who believe, do not go near prayer while you are drunk until you know what you're saying. So again, they ask again, and God doesn't forbid it. He just says, look, just don't come to prayer drunk, please. Because you don't know what you're saying. It's if you wanted to have a conversation with someone and you're sober yourself, it would be nice if the other person is sober. Those half sober, half drunk conversations aren't always the most productive. God is saying, look, just don't come to prayer drunk if you're going to drink. I already told you there's more harm in it than good. So if you're going to do it, just don't pray drunk, please. But they keep asking. And some narrations say that it was Omar, radiallahu anhu, that went to the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and don't get mad at Omar, but his name was Al-Faruq, which means the person, the criterion, the person who distinguishes between right and wrong. And he wanted to know, is this right or is this wrong? And so he went to the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he was like, I can't live with these verses that God's sending down. Is it halal or is it haram? And so God sends down a third verse, and he says, O you who believe, indeed, intoxicants, khamr, and gambling, look, again, he put those two together, and sacrificing on stone altars to other than God, or divining arrows, which is a way of fortune telling, basically, are but a defilement from the work of Satan. So avoid it, that you may be successful. So God's you really wanted to know. Yeah, it's bad for you. It's, again, from the works of Satan. So don't engage in it. Give it up. Now, there are hadiths about what happened in Medina when news of this revelation went out. And it said that you could smell wine running in the streets of Medina because people just started pouring out all of their wine. Now, this tells you two things. These were highly committed people by this point. They wanted to obey. This is something they wanted for themselves. It also tells you they had a bunch of wine in their homes. They Friday night, it's Juma's over, let's go. Let's have the boys over. Let's grill some steaks and, have some beers, right? So this is how we got to the prohibition on alcohol. And, similar to music, we may talk about music if we have time. We don't have time. We'll talk about music some other time. Similar to music, God mentions music sometimes in a negative light, but he always mentions it next to things like this, like gambling, partying, drinking as well, right? These are things that often went together. So God is saying, when you drink, it's not just that you drink, it's that you get up to this other stuff. as well. In that hadith that I told you about, where Hamza radiallahu anhu got drunk, there was a dancing girl that they had in his home, and she was singing, and she said, Hamza, go get that camel that's outside and like bring its liver in. We're gonna like cook it. And so Hamza gets his sword and goes and chops the humps off of 2 she camels. It's like, you don't just drink usually. And I don't know if you guys, hopefully not, have ever been to a frat party, but when you go to a frat party, you don't just drink. You do a whole bunch of other stuff that, you know, probably under sober circumstances you wouldn't get up to. So when God is forbidding things like this, like alcohol, and he doesn't forbid music, but when he sort of casts it in a negative light, it's because oftentimes there is an association with other things that are explicitly forbidden, right? That are explicitly forbidden. So I hope I've said enough about that. If there are questions, we can get into that in the Q&A. But that's pork and alcohol, and that I hope that gives some insight into like what these prohibitions are for, right? They're not to make your life boring. Let's see. And when it comes to all of this stuff, it is not simply the consumption of it that is forbidden to us. It is also the sale of these things, or otherwise profiting by these things. This is actually important to mention. There are many people in this city who have a negative association with Islam. Why? Because the people who sell them alcohol and who have sold them alcohol for a couple of generations now were Muslims. And I'm talking about like the corner stores on the south side and the west side. You guys know Common? DJ Common Sense? Well, look him up. He's a Chicago great, a Chicago legend. He like in a lot of his his songs, he talks about the Arab stores. Right? These are the corner stores. And he talks about getting lotto and malt liquor at the Arab stores. And for like an entire generation of African Americans, their association with Islam is like, these are the people who sell us alcohol. So obviously this is not an association that we want, but we need to know that this too is something that is forbidden, and it's forbidden for a reason. The people who will sell you alcohol, right, are harming you in the same way as they harm themselves if they were to drink it themselves. So this is something we need to be aware of. It's not just the consumption of these things. We don't profit by these things. So even if you're not like selling it in the corner store, like you don't want to be the guy driving the Budweiser truck if you can help it, right? And there are people who convert to this religion who have jobs like this. And that's okay, right? What you ought to do if you're in a situation like that is do your best, right? Do your best. Is it possible for you to get another line of work without causing hardship for yourself or your family? If the answer is yes, then do that. If the answer is no, then do your best, right? The point of none of this is to make your life difficult or unbearable. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The point of this is to give you ease in your life and to give ease to the lives of the people around you. That's where it all comes from. Now, I said we would say something about the term zabiha. So let's get into this. And I want to tell you guys a story where I was taking a class on fiqh, on like jurisprudence. I was learning law, basically. And we got to like the prohibitions of food. And we get into like you know, exactly what we were discussing tonight. And I'm like waiting to hear the term zabiha. And I ask a question that after asking it, I became incredibly embarrassed because I realized that I had just had the absolute wrong perception of what is halal and what is haram. So I want to make sure that everyone sort of hopefully gets this earlier in their life as a Muslim than I did, right? This isn't, to like call anyone out or say, or like, look, you're wrong the way you talk about like consuming meat, but it's just so that you know, and so that you are confused about this, hopefully for as short a period as possible. The word zabiha is a marketing term. It literally means dhabiha. It literally means slaughtered. Let me tell you something. All of your meat is slaughtered. If your meat isn't dhabiha, that animal's still alive, please don't eat it. Okay? Right? That's literally what it means. It means its neck was cut. Dhabaha. It was cut across the neck. So it does not have a place in our Sharia. Now, why is this important to point out? People will ask you, are you Zabiha? Are you Z? I'll just shorten it to the letter Z. Are you Z? It's like, I hope not. I don't feel anything. But no, the implication here is like, obviously you don't eat pork, but do you eat halal meat? Meaning like, is your steak, your beef steak, is it from a halal slaughtered animal? The implication here is that it's okay to eat a steak that is not from a halal slaughtered animal. That this is something like a sunnah or an action that is recommended to us rather than an action that is required of us. Are you guys following me? When it comes to the food that we can eat, there is halal and there is haram. There's no like middle ground of like, well, it's just not zabiha halal, right? I was out to dinner. I believe Stara was there when we were at the taco restaurant, and hopefully tonight, I'm being very diplomatic. Will Caldwell after hours is not so diplomatic. And someone asked me about this question. It was like, what is zabiha? What does that mean? And I was like, it doesn't mean anything. It's ridiculous. It's not even a word from our Sharia. I was like, if your steak doesn't come from an animal that was halal slaughtered, it is haram. I mean, I get worked up about this because I felt duped for many years. And I didn't realize, but the brother who was like a very new Muslim sitting across the table from me was eating a steak taco that was not, it was not zabiha halal. It wasn't halal. And he was just sitting there. He was like, should I put this down? So again, like we are all at different points in our practice. And I hope I've said that enough times throughout the course of this class that like you guys get it. Like if the next step in adopting this into your life is to stop eating pork chops, then just stop eating pork chops. Don't worry about going and getting halal steaks for yourself. Okay? Take it one step at a time, right? We're all at different levels in our practice. But also be very clear on what the expectations are. I say this all the time. We want to know what our North Star is. We want to know what we're shooting for so that we're headed in the right direction, at least. And if you think that zabiha is something that actually comes out of our sacred law, then you will not be going in the right direction. You might actually apply yourself. You might strive in an incorrect direction. And that's kind of a tragedy. That's something that happened to me for many, many years, simply because I got the wrong impression from the implications of the way that people talked about eating meat. All right, so that is what I want to convey to you guys. And I hope that's clear. If it's not, please ask me questions about that in the Q&A. And we have just a few minutes, and I want to say something about, we talk all the time about eating halal. We never talk about eating tayyib. And it's just as important because God puts it right there in that verse, right next to each other. These two things. Now, one of the big difficulties for us as Muslims is like if you wanted to like do a Venn diagram of like here's halal food and here is tayyib food, There is like just like a tiny little bit of overlap in most places in this country between those two categories of food. There's a lot of food that is halal. It was slaughtered the correct way, but maybe that animal had a poor life. Maybe its body was, and this is a reality, tortured during its life. I mean, there are animals that live in cruel conditions, and maybe you eat that and the quality of that animal. I mean, aside from the ethical issue of the treatment of that animal, but the quality of that animal is such that you may not really want to be putting that into your body if you actually knew how it lived, if you knew the food that it was forced to eat. A lot of animals eat food that they don't eat like in a state of nature. And that's bad for them. That causes them health problems. So finding food that is both halal and tayyib is actually pretty difficult. We're blessed here in the city of Chicago because there are resources for us. But Chicago is kind of like an oasis in many ways in this country. Um, so this is not a fatwa. Nothing in this chapter of the book, in fact, nothing in this class is ever a fatwa. I'm not a mufti. I can't give you a fatwa. This is my advice. This is my advice. Um, because in many places in this country, you can't find halal food, much less, and specifically talking about meat here. You can't find halal meat that is also tayyib. It's just not going to happen. Now, we've talked about taking dispensations before, right? A dispensation is like you take an opinion from another school of practice that maybe you wouldn't follow under normal circumstances. And there is a opinion in the Shafi'i madhab that because, and I preface, I disagree with this wholeheartedly. Like under perfect conditions, I totally disagree with this. But the argument is America is a Christian nation. Therefore, the meat slaughtered within the United States of America is being slaughtered in a Christian context. Christians are people of the book, therefore, that meat is halal. Now, why do I disagree with this? Because Christians don't have a Sharia, generally speaking, especially not Protestants. Jews do. They've got a word for it. It's called halakha. And it means the same thing that Sharia means, by the way. It means a path that one walks. Christians don't have that. In fact, most Protestant Christians believe that Jesus came to liberate us from the laws, right? He was the fulfillment of the laws. So there's not going to be any specific practice when most Christians, are slaughtering an animal. There will be no prayer that is said. And if you want to get right down to it, most of the slaughter is taking place in factory farms where the corporation has no religious affiliation whatsoever. So it's an argument that I think has a ton of holes in it. But if you live in a place where you don't have access to halal food, and on top of that, the halal food that you do have access to is of a poor quality, choose what is tayyib over what is halal. Someone will discover this YouTube video, and I don't have Twitter, but if I did, I would get angry tweets, I'm sure, for saying that. But again, it's not a fatwa. It's not a fatwa. This is just my advice. Allah calls us to both the halal and the tayyib. And, in a lot of places in this country, you can go out, and this is really like, this is, if you don't have any other options. But if you want to put some effort into this, and I actually recommend this even for the people living in the city of Chicago, um, there are ranchers around you. You can go to farms where they have animals. Go meet those people, right? Go meet them and establish a relationship there. I guarantee you they would love to sell you beef or lamb or goat directly because their margins when they send it to like these factories where they slaughter the animals are incredibly thin. They don't make a lot of money off of doing that. You go to them directly, you can get a better price and they can also get a better profit off of that. They would love it. I guarantee it. And get to know these people and say, like, look, hey, look, you go out into the countryside, it's not like the city. A lot of people are actually Christian. And just ask them, like, hey, um, I do this thing like where I eat animals that when they're slaughtered, God's name is mentioned. So would you mind, like, when you slaughter this chicken or you slaughter this cow, would you just mind like saying a little prayer as you do that? I bet you would find a lot of people that are actually perfectly happy to do something like that. And you're not only making your life better, you're making the life of that rancher better as well. So make these relationships. This is a good thing to do. This is a really good thing to do. And when it comes to tayyib, let's not just limit ourselves to meat. Um, if I might be so bold as to make a recommendation, uh, shop on the perimeter of the supermarket as much as you can. Avoid the aisles, really, and like cook food at home as much as you can because there is a lot of junk. Just because it's in the supermarket, do not assume that it's food. Like, really, don't assume that it's food just because it's in the supermarket. A lot of this stuff is highly profitable to sell to you as food. The margins on it are really big. Like sugary cereals cost very, very little to make, but they mark it up to a point where they're making bank on every box of cereal. And the only reason they're selling it to you is because they're making bank. They are not trying to nourish your body. They're trying to make profit, which in and of itself is not a bad thing. But we are at a point in this country where people are allowed to do this to the detriment of the health of the people that they are serving. So be aware. Be aware. People have been eating bell peppers for a long time. People have been eating steaks for a long time. People have been drinking milk for a long time. Not everyone. I'm European, so my people drink milk. Not everyone is lactose tolerant. But the stuff that your great grandparents would eat that. You can assume that that is tayyib. If your great grandparents did not eat it, try to avoid it. Try to avoid it as much as you possibly can. And if you ever, I'm a health nut, by the way. If this is interesting to anyone, please like chat me up after class or some other time. I'll give you a whole lot more recommendations than that. I take this stuff very, very seriously. It started after I had kids, where I realized like, you know, their health is literally in my hands. I need to take it seriously. So if this is something that interests you, something you would like to pursue, and I hope that it is, because this is your life. What you eat will affect your religion. We talked about that, right? It affects your spiritual state. It affects your life, obviously. It affects your health. It affects your intellect. Really, like you start eating better, watch the mental fog, watch the procrastination, watch it dissipate. It absolutely affects your intellect. It affects your family, right? Men, did you know that testosterone levels and sorry to get a little bit graphic, but like sperm counts are down to unprecedented levels in human history. Did you guys know this? Yeah, it's true. It's true. Your ability literally to have children depends on what you put into your body. A lot of men are infertile nowadays. So it absolutely affects family and it affects wealth. If you don't have health, you can't get wealth. Health is wealth, is the saying we have in this country. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلى الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر آمين